Some evictions hit like a slap, but this one felt like a key turning in a lock. When my daughter-in-law switched off the 6 o'clock news and told me to get out, I did not argue. I grabbed my purse because I needed them to think I was broken. Outside, a stranger in an idling sedan warned me not to go home alone. I realized then that I had not been kicked out. I had been positioned on a stage. My name is Marilyn Costello. I am 57 years old, a woman carved from the stubborn bedrock of Irish immigrants and Italian laborers, and I have lived in Riverside Hills, Ohio, long enough to know the difference between a bad mood and a conspiracy. I was currently residing in the guest room of my son's colonial-style house, a temporary arrangement necessitated by a total knee replacement surgery 3 weeks prior. My leg was propped up on the ottoman, a bag of thawing peas balancing precariously on the joint, while the local news droned on about a zoning dispute in the next county. It was a Tuesday evening, quiet and unremarkable, until the atmosphere in the room shifted with a sudden, violent drop in pressure. The television screen went black. The remote hit the coffee table with a hard plastic clatter. I looked up to see my daughter-in-law, Blair Kessler, standing directly between me and the dark screen. Her posture was rigid, her face stripped of any casual warmth she usually feigned for the neighbors. She looked at me with eyes that were entirely void of empathy. "Get out," she said. The command hung in the air, cold and absolute. I blinked, my mind instinctively searching for a punchline, a reason, a context that would make this a joke. I shifted my gaze to the kitchen island where my son, Evan Costello, was standing. He was gripping a dish towel so tightly his knuckles had turned the color of bone. He did not look at me. He stared fixedly at the granite countertop, refusing to meet my eyes. "Evan?" I asked, my voice calm but laced with confusion. "Mom." "Just go," Evan whispered, his voice cracking. He looked physically ill, his shoulders hunched as if expecting a blow. "Please, don't make this harder than it has to be." I did not scream. I did not demand an explanation. Decades of working as an internal auditor had trained me to notice anomalies, and right now, the data points were screaming a warning. If I fought, I would be the hysterical old woman. If I argued, I would be the aggressor. I reached for my cane, gritting my teeth against the sharp spike of pain that shot through my healing knee as I stood. I grabbed my handbag from the cushion. That was when I saw it. Blair had not just moved to turn off the TV. She had positioned herself strategically in front of the hallway entrance, her body blocking the direct line of sight to the oak filing cabinet in the study, the cabinet where the family trust documents and property deeds were kept. She was not just evicting me. She was guarding the paper trail. I walked to the front door, the sound of my cane tapping against the hardwood marking the rhythm of my departure. As I stepped onto the porch and the heavy door began to close behind me, I heard the faint, electronic chirp of a call connecting. "The plan is done for tonight," Blair whispered, her voice low but carrying through the crack. "She is leaving now." The door clicked shut. I stood alone in the cooling evening air, the wind cutting through my cardigan. I reached into my bag for my phone to call a taxi, my hands shaking not from cold, but from a dawning, icy realization. Before I could unlock my screen, a grey sedan that had been idling down the street pulled up to the curb. It was an older model, nondescript and dusted with road grime. A man in his late 40s stepped out. He looked tired, wearing a suit that had seen better days, but his eyes were sharp and focused entirely on me. He did not ask who I was. He knew. Mrs. Costello, he said, his tone urgent and lacking any pleasantries. You can't go back to your own house tonight? I froze, my thumb hovering over the dial pad. Excuse me? Do not go back to your own house, he repeated, stepping closer but keeping a respectful distance. If you go there alone, you won't be coming back out. I turned my head to look back at my son's house. The porch light flickered and died, plunging the entryway into darkness. The curtains in the living room were drawn tight. I looked back at the stranger, and the auditor in me finally connected the disparate pieces of evidence. Blair's timing, Evan's rehearsed silence, the blocked files, the phone call. This was not an emotional outburst. This was a tactical extraction. I was not just being kicked out, I was being maneuvered. To understand how I ended up on a curb with a stranger warning me for my life, you have to look back 8 months. Before my knee gave out, and certainly before my son lost his spine. I was the lead internal auditor for Northbridge Civic Solutions. For 3 decades, I made a living finding the discrepancies that people tried very hard to hide. I could spot a padded invoice or a ghost employee from 3 spreadsheets away. I retired early, not because I was tired of the work, but because I wanted to enjoy the peace I had earned. I never imagined that the most dangerous audit of my life would be conducted at my own dining room table. The erosion of my authority was not a landslide. It was a slow, dripping leak. It started shortly after Evan married Blair. Sunday dinners, which used to be the highlight of my week, transformed into theatrical performances where I was the unwitting jester. Blair developed a habit of rewriting history over roast chicken. "Oh, Marilyn, you are telling that story again," she would say, offering a tight, pitying smile to Evan. "You told us that one last week. Remember, you got the ending wrong then, too." I had not told that story in a year. At first, I laughed it off. I assumed it was just a generational clash, or perhaps she was right. But then the strategy shifted. Blair stopped talking to me and started talking for me. She began to treat Evan like a ventriloquist's dummy. If I asked Evan a question about his job or their vacation plans, Blair would answer before he could open his mouth. "Evan thinks we should wait on the trip," she would say, placing a hand on his forearm to silence him. "He is worried about your health." "Marilyn, we don't want to be too far away if you have another episode. Episode. That was the word she planted. I had never had an episode in my life. The real warning shot came on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. I was in their kitchen, helping to dry dishes, when Blair left her phone on the counter to check the laundry. The screen lit up with a message. I am not a snoop, but my auditor's eyes are trained to catch data. The text was from a contact saved only as M.R. It read, "Her assets are messy, need to clean them up before she changes her mind." I stared at the screen until it went black. My assets were not messy. My portfolio was meticulous. But the phrase "clean them up" sounded less like financial advice and more like a sanitation crew preparing a crime scene. After that, the pattern became undeniable. My bank statements, which I had received by mail for 40 years, suddenly stopped arriving. When I called the bank, they told me I had opted for paperless billing and listed an email address I did not recognize. Appointments with my cardiologist vanished from the system. I would show up at the clinic only to be told I had cancelled 2 days prior. Then came the paperwork. Evan came to my house one evening, looking like a man marching to the gallows. He placed a thick stack of documents on my coffee table. "It's just to Simplify things. Mom, he stammered, avoiding my eyes. Since you're going into surgery soon, Blair and I thought it would be better if we could handle the insurance and the bills for you, just so you can focus on healing. I looked at the papers. Buried between standard medical liability waivers were heavy legal authorizations. I should have thrown them in the fire. But I looked at my son, my gentle, quiet Evan, and I saw the fear in his eyes. I thought he was afraid for my health. I realized too late he was afraid of his wife. I signed them. I signed away my shield, because I trusted the blood in his veins more than the ink on the page. The interrogations followed. Blair's interest in my life narrowed down to 3 specific things: the combination to my floor safe, the deeds to the old rental property I owned in the city, and the Patrick Costello Memorial Fund. Is that fund actually doing anything? She asked one night, swirling her wine. I mean, Patrick has been gone for 6 years. Don't you think that money could be invested better for the family's future? She made my husband's legacy sound like a waste of resources. That was the moment the sadness in me turned into cold iron. 2 days before the surgery, I visited Patrick's grave. It was a grey, windy day. I knelt in the grass and ran my hand over the granite headstone. I remembered how hard he had worked, how he had warned me that the world could be cruel to widows. I realized then that the threat wasn't the world. It was the people inviting themselves into my living room. I won't let them do it. Pat, I whispered to the cold ground. I promise you. I will not become just another asset to be liquidated. I stood up, my bad knee screaming in protest, but my mind clear for the first time in months. I had signed their papers. Yes. But they had forgotten who I was. You do not survive 30 years in corporate auditing without learning how to keep a backup file. They wanted a confused old woman. I decided right then that I would give them exactly what they wanted, right up until the moment I burned their entire scheme to the ground. The man driving the sedan introduced himself as Grant Halverson. He did not look like a police officer, and he certainly did not look like a social worker. He had the tired, cynical air of a man who spent his life cleaning up messes that the law was too clumsy to handle. He told me he was a private investigator on retainer for a law firm, but he refused to name the attorney. We pulled into a nondescript motel off the highway, the kind of place where people went when they wanted to vanish for a night or two. The neon sign buzzed with a low hum. Inside the room, the smell of lemon polish and stale cigarettes hung in the air. I sat on the edge of the stiff mattress, gripping my cane, waiting for him to explain why I was a fugitive in my own town. Grant pulled a chair from the corner and sat facing me. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. Mrs. Costello, I am going to be blunt, because we do not have time for politeness, Grant said, his voice gravelly. You are currently being shepherded into a guardianship filing. The word hit me harder than the cold wind outside. Guardianship. It was a term I knew well from my days auditing civic accounts. It was a legal mechanism designed to protect the infirm and the incapable, stripping them of their rights to manage their own money, their own health care, and their own lives. In the wrong hands, it was a prison sentence served in your own home. That is ridiculous, I said, though my voice lacked conviction. I am recovering from knee surgery, not dementia. I just retired from a senior auditing position. And that is exactly why they need to move fast, Grant countered. They need you to look unstable. Tonight was the trigger. If you had stayed, there would have been an incident. A fall. A screaming match. Police would be called. A report would be filed, stating you were aggressive and confused. He reached into his jacket pocket and tossed a series of photographs onto the small round table between us. They were grainy, taken with a night vision lens. But the subject was clear. It was a man leaving my son's house just 10 minutes after I'd been forced out. He was carrying a thick, expanded file folder under his arm. "They are moving the paper trail," Grant explained. "Your son kept you busy while the house was scrubbed." I felt a wave of nausea. I pulled my phone from my purse and dialed the 24-hour service line for my primary bank. I needed to hear a sane voice. I needed to prove him wrong. When the representative answered, I gave my security questions. There was a pause on the line. "Mrs. Costello," the operator asked, sounding confused. I am looking at the log here." "Didn't we just speak to your authorized representative 10 minutes ago? He said you were resting and needed to authorize a temporary freeze due to, well, he said you were having trouble keeping track of transactions." "My representative?" I asked, my hand tightening around the phone until my knuckles turned white. "Was it a man? Did he sound young?" "Yes, ma'am. He had all the correct passcodes. It was Evan. My son had used the information I trusted him with to lock me out of my own life." I hung up the phone and looked at Grant. The shock was receding, replaced by the cold, hard clarity of a professional who realizes the books have been cooked. "If I go back there," I started. "If you go back there alone, you are walking into a trap." Grant finished. "They will claim you are wandering, paranoid, and a danger to yourself. By Monday morning, an emergency petition will be on a judge's desk, and you will lose the right to sign a check." "Who hired you?" I demanded. "If you aren't with the police, and you aren't with the family, who is paying for this room?" Grant looked at me for a long moment. "A client who knew this might happen. Someone who prepared an exit for you, a long time ago." He reached into his inner pocket again. This time, he did not produce a photo. He pulled out a thick, yellowed envelope. The paper was aged, the corners slightly bent. He placed it gently on the table in front of me. My breath hitched. I knew that handwriting. It was blocky, practical, and pressed hard into the paper. It was the handwriting of a man who had been dead for 6 years, written on the front, in my late husband's distinct script, were instructions that made my heart stop. "Marilyn, open when our son stands with his wife." My hands trembled as I broke the seal on the envelope. The paper felt heavy, thick, with the weight of a voice I had not heard in 6 years. Patrick had been a union man, a negotiator for the steelworkers who spent his life staring down corporate lawyers across mahogany tables. He was not a man given to poetry or sentimentality. He dealt in leverage and contracts. I unfolded the single sheet of yellow legal pad paper. The date at the top was from 2 weeks before his massive heart attack. He had known he was sick, even when he told me it was just indigestion. "Marilyn," the letter began, his handwriting a jagged, forceful scrawl. "If you are reading this, then my worst fear has come to pass. I love our son, but we both know Evan is soft. He wants to please everyone, and that makes him dangerous when he is with the wrong person. I do not trust Blair. I never have. She looks at this family and sees a balance sheet, not a home. And I am not sure Evan is strong enough to stand up to her." I felt a hot tear track down my cheek, but I wiped it away, angrily. It was a bitter thing to realize that my dead husband had seen the predator in my daughter-in-law while I was still trying to buy her affection with Sunday roasts and compliments. The letter continued. I have set up a secondary layer to the trust. You do not know about it because I did not want you to worry, and I did not want Evan to know it existed until it was necessary. There is a clause, Marilyn, a failsafe, but you cannot trigger it until they make their move. Go to Diane Weller. She is the only lawyer in town who hates bullies more than I do. And listen to me. Do not confront them early. Let them tie the knot themselves. If you fight too soon, they will just change tactics. Let them think they have won. I lowered the paper. The silence in the motel room was deafening. I felt a surge of indignation. Patrick had managed me, even from the grave. He had anticipated my vulnerability and prepared for it. Part of me wanted to scream at him for keeping secrets, for not trusting me to handle this myself. But another part, the part of me that was currently sitting in a cheap motel while my son locked me out of my bank accounts, knew he was right. I looked up at Grant. He was watching me with a neutral expression, giving me space to process the betrayal. He told me once, I said softly, staring at the faded floral pattern of the bedspread. Patrick told me that people do not rob you with guns anymore. He said they rob you with papers, signatures, powers of attorney. He said it is cleaner that way. Grant nodded slowly. Your husband was a smart man. Diane Weller is the one who hired me, Mrs. Costello. She has been monitoring the filings at the county clerk's office. She flagged your file 3 days ago. Why 3 days ago? I asked. Because that is when a preliminary medical report was uploaded to a private server used by court-appointed evaluators. Grant revealed, it claims you have advanced cognitive decline. They are building a fake medical history, Mrs. Costello. They are not just going to take your money. They are going to take your mind. They need the court to believe you are incompetent so they can become your legal guardians. The horror of it settled in my stomach like a stone. They were not just greedy. They were willing to erase me. They were willing to rewrite my reality to suit their budget. I looked back at Patrick's letter. Let them think they have won. I folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the envelope. I dried my eyes. When I looked up at Grant again, the trembling in my hands had stopped. Okay, I said, my voice steady. If they want a confused, helpless old woman, I will give them one. I will play the part. But I want a recorder. I want copies of every email. I am going to let them drag me to that cliff edge, Grant. And then I am going to push them off. Diane Weller's office in downtown Dayton was not a sanctuary of high-priced justice. It was a small, windowless room on the second floor of a brick building that smelled faintly of old coffee and photocopier toner. There were no plush carpets or mahogany desks, only metal filing cabinets that lined the walls like sentries. Diane herself was a woman of sharp angles and grey suits, with eyes that seemed to scan for weakness before she even shook your hand. She did not offer me tea. She offered me a strategy. They are trying to construct a legal narrative of total incapacity, Diane said, leaning back in her creaking chair. Blair is the architect, but Evan is the executioner. He is likely the one signing the affidavits stating you are a danger to yourself. If they succeed, you become a ward of the state, and they become the stewards of your estate. I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach. Evan wouldn't. He wouldn't go that far. People do terrible things when they are desperate or manipulated. Diane replied flatly. We need to make them think you have surrendered. You are going back to that house. Marilyn, you are going to apologize. You are going to be the confused, fragile old woman they want you to be. But you are going to document everything. Write down times, names, pill colors, and conversations in a notebook you keep hidden on your body. Do not record audio. As Ohio is a one-party consent state, but judges hate secret tapes in family court. We need written, contemporaneous notes. I returned to my son's house at 4 in the afternoon. I walked with a deliberate limp, leaning heavily on my cane even though my knee was feeling stronger. When Blair opened the door, I did not meet her eyes. I looked at the floor. I am sorry about last night. Blair, I stammered, making sure my voice trembled. I don't know what came over me. The pain medication. It makes things foggy. Blair smiled, but it did not reach her eyes. It is okay. Marilyn, we just want you safe. We were so worried when you wandered off. She had bought the act for the next 3 days. I lived in the belly of the beast. I was a model of compliance, but my mind was sharpening like a blade. Blair wasted no time. On Thursday, she brought in a man she introduced as Dr. Aris, a specialist in memory care. He was not my doctor. He asked me simple questions in a patronizing tone, but I noticed he twisted my answers in his notes. Do you know what year it is? Marilyn? He asked. It is 2025. I said. He hummed and wrote something down. Later? When he left his clipboard on the coffee table to use the restroom. I glanced at it. He had written, patient hesitated significantly, oriented only to self. Then came the neighbour, Mrs. Gable. She came over for tea and loudly recounted a story about seeing me walking in my nightgown at 2 in the morning. I had been asleep in bed at that time. I smiled and nodded at her lies, while mentally noting that Mrs. Gable's husband worked for a contracting firm that Evan had recently hired. The connections were subtle, but they were there. I was playing my part perfectly. But the cracks were starting to show in Evan. He looked haggard, his skin pale and his eyes constantly darting toward Blair for approval. On Saturday morning, I was standing in the kitchen, staring at the coffee maker. Evan walked in. Blair was in the shower upstairs. The water was running. For the first time in days, we were truly alone. Evan moved to the fridge to get a bottle of water. As he passed me, he did not speak. He did not look at my face. But his hand brushed against mine, and I felt the sharp edge of paper against my palm. My heart hammered against my ribs. I closed my fingers around the scrap and waited until he left the room before I unfolded it. It was a torn corner of a grocery receipt, scrawled in frantic, messy ink. Mom, don't trust anyone. I am stuck. I stared at the words, my breath catching in my throat. Stuck. Not greedy, not hateful. Stuck. I looked toward the living room where my son sat with his head in his hands. A new realization washed over me, colder than the winter air outside. Blair was ambitious. Yes, and cruel. But she was not a mastermind. This operation, the fake doctor, the coordinated witnesses, the legal filings was too professional, too expensive, and too orchestrated for a suburban housewife and a mid-level manager. Evan was not just being manipulated by his wife. Someone else was pulling the strings. There was a third player in this game, someone invisible who had turned my family into a weapon against me. And I realized with terrifying clarity that I wasn't just fighting for my money anymore. I was fighting to save my son from a trap that was already closing around his neck. The siege of my life began not with bars on the windows, but with the quiet, systematic removal of my autonomy. Blair moved with the efficiency of a prison warden. First, she announced she would manage my medication schedule to prevent accidental overdoses, locking my pills in a drawer I could not access. Next, the Wi-Fi password on my tablet stopped working. When I asked about it, she claimed the router was broken, yet I watched her stream movies on her phone in the den. Then came the bills. She intercepted the mail before it hit the mat, insisting she was just helping me organize my finances to reduce my stress. But the stress was not reducing. It was suffocating me. During a rare moment when Blair was in the shower, I managed to log into my bank account on Evan's laptop, which he had carelessly left open on the kitchen island. My heart hammered against my ribs as I scrolled through the transaction history. There were transfers I did not recognize. $3,000 here, $2,500 there, all funneling into a company called Clear Pine Advisory. It sounded professional, vague, and utterly meaningless. I scribbled the name on the back of a napkin and hid it in my bra just as the water upstairs stopped running. The social isolation was just as calculated. One afternoon, Mrs. Higgins from my church stopped by to drop off a casserole. Blair tried to block her at the door, but I managed to hobble into the hallway. Mrs. Higgins looked at me with pity that stung worse than a slap. "Oh, Marilyn," she whispered, while Blair was in the kitchen getting plates. "I was so worried after your niece called. She said you were having violent outbursts during Mass." "I don't have a niece. Linda?" I said, my voice low and trembling. Before she could respond, Blair returned, smiling like a shark. She had been calling my community, using a fake name, planting seeds of my insanity long before the harvest. That evening, Diane Weller called my burner phone, which I kept taped under the drawer of the nightstand. Her voice was tight. "They filed the paperwork. Marilyn," Diane said. "The petition for emergency guardianship is sitting on a judge's desk at the county court right now. The hearing is set for Friday morning. They are moving faster than I expected. They are terrified I will figure it out." I replied. "Stay calm," Diane warned. "They are going to try to provoke you. Do not give them a show." She was right. The provocation came at dinner. I was reaching for the water pitcher when Blair's hand shot out. She knocked a crystal glass off the table. It shattered on the tiles with a sound like a gunshot. Marilyn Blair shrieked, jumping back. "Look what you did. You are losing control of your hands again." I sat frozen. I had not touched the glass. I looked at Evan. He was sitting right there. He had seen her hand move. He had seen her push it. "Evan," I said, looking at my son. "Tell her." Evan looked at the shattered glass, then at his wife, and finally at his plate. He picked up his fork and began to eat, his face draining of color. "Mum, just let Blair clean it up," he murmured. "Please, stop throwing things." The silence that followed was heavy enough to crush bones. It was a betrayal so profound it left me breathless. I realized then that the incident with the TV last week was just the opening act. They did not just want me out of the house. They wanted a documented history of emotional volatility. Every time I reacted, I was digging my own grave. Later that night, Grant sent a message through Diane. He had traced the money trail, the payment to Dr. Aris, the memory specialist who had evaluated me for 10 minutes and declared me incompetent, had not come from an insurance company. It had been a direct wire transfer of $5,000, and it had come from an account in Evan's name. It does not make sense. I told Diane during our brief, hushed call, Evan is frugal. He doesn't have that kind of liquid cash to throw at corrupt doctors. That is the key. Marilyn? Diane said, her voice dropping to a whisper. Grant found something else. There are huge withdrawals from Evan's corporate account covering gambling debts or bad investments. We think Blair knows. She isn't just manipulating him with love. She is holding a gun to his head. If this guardianship doesn't go through, if they don't get access to your trust to cover his hole, Evan goes to prison for embezzlement. I lowered the phone, feeling the room spin. My son was not just a weak man standing by his wife. He was a desperate man standing on a trapdoor, and he was willing to drop his own mother through it to save himself from the fall. The preparation for the hearing was not about learning what to say. It was about learning what to swallow. Diane Weller sat across from me in her cramped office, her demeanor as sharp as a scalpel. She did not coddle me. She drilled me. We were preparing for a performance where the reviews would determine whether I spent the rest of my life as a free woman or a prisoner in a state-run facility. Marilyn, listen to me, Diane said, leaning forward until her eyes locked with mine. In that courtroom, you cannot be the grieving widow or the betrayed mother. They want you to be emotional. They want you to scream at Blair or cry out to Evan. If you do that, the judge sees instability. You need to be boring. You need to be so dangerously calm that their accusations slide right off you. I practiced my answers. Short, clear, devoid of the rage that was boiling in my gut. Mrs. Costello. Do you often forget to pay your bills? Diane asked, role-playing the opposing counsel. No, I answered. I have automated payments set up since 2010. Good. Diane nodded. Play weak physically if you have to. Lean on that cane. Let them think you are frail. But when you speak, do not be vague. Vagueness is where they hide their lies. The door opened and Grant walked in. He looked exhausted, carrying a sheaf of papers that smelled of fresh ink. He dropped them on the desk with a heavy thud. I found it, Grant said, his voice grim. They thought deleting the emails from the inbox was enough, but they forgot about the local server backups. This is from 3 months ago, between Blair and an encrypted address. I looked at the highlighted text. It was a digital smoking gun. We need to activate the guardianship protocol by winter. We have to push her out before she decides to audit the trust herself. Activate, I whispered, reading the word again, like I am a machine to be shut down. It gets worse, Grant said. He pointed to a second document. I ran a background check on Clearpine Advisory. On paper, it is a consulting firm. But the registered address, it matches the home office of a lawyer who was disbarred 5 years ago for elder fraud. His name does not appear on the website, but he is the one pulling the strings. Blair isn't just being greedy. She is working with a professional predator. Diane picked up the trust document my husband had left me, the one I had retrieved from the safe deposit box only yesterday. She flipped to the back page, her finger tracing a paragraph written in dense legalese. Patrick knew, Diane said, a rare look of admiration crossing her face. Marilyn, look at this. It is a conditional forfeiture clause. Patrick put a poison pill in the trust. It says that any beneficiary who legally challenges the mental competency of the primary trustee, that is you, automatically forfeits their entire share of the inheritance. I stared at the paper. My hands started to shake. Patrick had built a trap for the people who would try to hurt me. But the realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. Evan? I said, my voice cracking. If Evans stands up in court tomorrow and testifies that I am incompetent, he disinherits himself. He loses everything. Yes, Diane said. And he doesn't know it. Blair doesn't know it. They think they are fighting for the pot of gold. But if they pull the trigger, the gold vanishes. I felt a tear slide down my cheek, hot and stinging. He is my son, Diane. If I let him do this, I destroy him. But if I stop him, if you stop him, you let him destroy you. Diane cut in, her voice hard. He is an adult. Marilyn. He made his choice when he signed that affidavit. You cannot save a man who is holding the match to his own house. She stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the grey Dayton skyline. Revenge is not screaming. Marilyn, Diane said softly, not turning around. Revenge is not making a scene. Revenge is simply letting the truth fall exactly where the public can see it. We are not going to attack them. We are just going to turn on the lights and let them see the mess they made. I left the office an hour later. The evening air was cold. I sat in my car in the parking lot, the engine idling. I looked down at my hand. I was gripping Patrick's old wedding band, the gold worn smooth by 40 years of labour and loyalty. It felt warm against my skin. I thought of Evan. I thought of the little boy who used to cling to my leg when it thundered. And then I thought of the man who stood in the kitchen and watched his wife shatter a glass to frame me. I am sorry. Evan. I whispered to the empty car. I am going to save you. But it is going to hurt. I put the car in gear and drove toward the hotel. The trap was set. Tomorrow. I would not be the victim. I would be the one springing the steel jaws. The Montclair County Courthouse was a cavern of polished wood and echoing footsteps, buzzing with the low-frequency hum of a small town that smelled a scandal. The gallery was fuller than usual. I spotted a reporter from the Riverside Gazette in the back row, pen poised over a notebook. My family's private implosion had become public theatre. Blair had dressed for the part of the saintly caregiver. She wore a cardigan in a soft, non-threatening shade of blue and kept her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She looked like she had not slept in weeks, a masterpiece of makeup designed to simulate exhausted concern. Beside her, Evan looked like a man made of ash. He stared at the table, refusing to look left or right. Mark Sutter, their attorney, was a man who took up too much space. He moved around the courtroom with the swagger of a predator who believes the hunt is already over. He laid out their case with brutal efficiency. Your Honor. Sutter boomed, his voice filling the room. We are not here to punish Mrs. Costello. We are here to protect her. The evidence shows a clear pattern of decline. Missed medical appointments. Erratic spending. In the last month alone, she has withdrawn over $4,000 in cash with no recollection of where it went. I sat in my chair, my hands folded over the head of my cane. My bad knee was throbbing with a dull, rhythmic ache, causing my leg to tremble visibly. I did not try to stop it. Let them see the tremor. Let them mistake pain for fear. I kept my face blank, a slate upon which they could project whatever senility they wanted to see. Judge Rosalind Kemp sat high on the bench. She was a woman in her 60s with steel-grey hair cut in a sharp bob and eyes that had seen every variation of human greed the county had to offer. She listened to Sutter's opening tirade without changing expression. When he finished, she turned her gaze not to Blair, but to my son, Mr. Costello, Judge Kemp said, her voice deceptively mild. You are the petitioner. Tell me, in your own words, how have you been caring for your mother since her surgery? Evan stood up slowly. He looked terrified. I have tried to do what is best. Evan stammered, his voice barely audible. She has been confused. We just want to make sure she doesn't hurt herself. Confused how the judge pressed. She forgets things, Evan said, wiping sweat from his forehead, before he could continue. Blair leaned forward, unable to help herself. She placed a hand on Evan's arm, effectively silencing him. Your Honor, if I may, Blair interjected, her voice smooth and practiced. Evan is too modest. We have been managing her entire recovery. We have taken her to every physical therapy session since June, even when she fought us. Diane Weller did not stand up. She did not object. She simply looked at her notes and spoke clearly from her seat. For the record, Your Honor, Diane said, Mrs. Costello's knee replacement surgery was on August 12th. If the petitioners were taking her to therapy in June, they were treating a joint that had not yet been operated on. The silence in the room was sudden and sharp. Mark Sutter stiffened. Blair blinked, realizing her script had just snagged on a fact. I meant pre-operative therapy. Blair corrected quickly, her smile tightening. Noted, Judge Kemp said, jotting something down. The scratch of her pen was loud in the quiet room. Sutter tried to recover the momentum by calling their star witness, Mrs. Gable, the neighbor who had claimed I was wandering at night. Mrs. Gable took the stand, looking nervous in a floral dress. She recited her story about seeing me in the street at 2 a.m, but her eyes kept darting toward Blair. Diane walked up to the witness stand for the cross-examination. She did not look aggressive. She looked bored. Mrs. Gable, Diane asked. You stated that the streetlights were out that night. Is that correct? Yes. Mrs. Gable nodded. It was very dark. So how did you know it was Mrs. Costello, Diane asked. From 50 feet away, in the dark well. I knew it was her coat. Mrs. Gable said, looking at her hands. Her coat. Diane pressed. Or did someone tell you it was her coat? Did Mrs. Kessler perhaps mention what Mrs. Costello was wearing that day? Well, Blair said. Mrs. Gable stopped, her eyes going wide. She realized she had walked into a trap. We talked about it later. I was just trying to help. Helping is noble, Mrs. Gable, Diane said coldly. Reciting a script is perjury. Diane turned back to the defense table. Mark Sutter was red in the face, whispering furiously to Blair. Evan had sunk lower in his chair, looking like he wished the floor would open up and swallow him whole. Judge Kemp leaned forward, resting her chin on her hand. The atmosphere in the room had shifted. The air was no longer heavy with my defeat. It was electric with the charge of a turning tide. Mr. Sutter, the judge said, her voice hard. Your case seems to rely heavily on anecdotes that dissolve under scrutiny. She turned her gaze to Diane. Ms. Weller, Judge Kemp said. Does the defense have any evidence to present? Or are we done here? Diane stood up. She picked up the thick file of documents Grant had compiled, the emails, the bank transfers, the photos of the man leaving my house. She placed them on the table with a heavy, deliberate thud that echoed like a gavel. We have a great deal of evidence, Your Honor, Diane said, and I believe the court will find it very illuminating. The room held its breath. I looked at Blair. For the first time since she had told me to get out, I saw the cracks in her mask. She was not looking at the judge. She was looking at the file on the table, and she looked like a woman who heard the lock clicking shut on her own cell. The courtroom air shifted from heavy to suffocating as Diane Weller walked back to her table and picked up a single flash drive. She held it up, not like a weapon, but like a specimen. Your Honor. The defense submits into evidence a recovered archive of digital correspondence between the petitioner, Blair Kessler, and her husband, Evan Costello, Diane announced, her voice cutting through the room's low murmur. These emails were deleted from their devices but were preserved on a synchronized cloud backup server. The metadata dates back to 14 months ago. Mark Sutter jumped to his feet, his chair screeching against the floor. Objection. This is a violation of privacy and has no relevance to Mrs. Costello's current medical state. It has every relevance, Diane countered, her tone icy. It establishes that the plan to evict Mrs. Costello was not a reaction to a medical crisis, but a premeditated strategy to manufacture one. Judge Kemp adjusted her glasses, looking at Sutter with profound irritation. Overruled. If these communications discuss the ward, they are admissible. Read the excerpt, Ms. Weller. Diane picked up a printed sheet. The room went silent. I looked at Evan. He was gripping the edge of the table so hard his fingertips were white. Email dated October 12th, 1 year ago. Diane read, Sender Blair Kessler. Subject the house. The text reads, We need to activate the guardianship protocol by winter. We have to push her out to create a record of instability before she decides to audit the trust herself. A gasp rippled through the gallery. I felt a phantom pain in my chest, a dull ache that had nothing to do with my heart and everything to do with the people I had cooked dinner for every Sunday. And this, Diane continued, picking up a second sheet. An email from Evan Costello, dated 2 days later. I don't know if I can do this. She is my mother. For a second, I felt a flicker of hope, but Diane was not done. And the reply from Mr. Costello, sent later that same night, seemingly to himself, a draft that was never sent, but was saved to the server. Diane read. It says, Blair says if I don't do it, I lose everything. She has the files on the loan. I have no choice. I stared at my son. He was weeping silently, tears tracking through the ash-grey pallor of his face. He had not started this because he hated me. He had started this because he was already a hostage. Diane did not let the emotions settle. She moved to the financial records. We also have a bank transfer record, she stated, projecting a document onto the court screen. $5,000 wired to Dr. Aris. The payment date is the day before he examined Mrs. Costello. This was not a fee for treatment. It was a purchase of a diagnosis. Sutter looked like he was trying to shrink inside his suit. Blair was staring straight ahead, her jaw set in a rigid line, but I saw the tremor in her hands. Finally, Diane said, signaling to the bailiff to open the side door. The defense calls Grant Halverson to the stand. Grant walked in, looking far more respectable in a suit than he had in the motel room. He took the oath and sat down. Diane wasted no time. She handed him the stack of grainy night vision photos. Mr. Halverson, please identify the man in this photograph. Taken leaving the Costello residence on the night of the eviction, Diane said. Grant held up the picture. That is Miles Rourke. And who is Miles Rourke? He is a senior consultant for Clearpine Advisory, Grant answered, his voice projecting clearly to the back of the room. He is not a lawyer, and he is not a financial planner. He is a specialist in high-asset liquidation. My investigation found that Mr. Rourke has been named in 3 other sealed guardianship cases in the state. In every case, he approached a younger family member with debts, offered a solution involving the elder's assets, and took a 15% commission on the estate once the guardianship was granted. The revelation hit the courtroom like a physical shockwave. Blair closed her eyes. The narrative of the loving daughter-in-law had not just cracked, it had shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. It was not just a family dispute anymore. It was a racketeering scheme. Judge Kemp looked furious. She leaned over the bench, her eyes narrowing at the defense table. "Mr. Sutter," she said, her voice dangerously low. "Is Mr. Rourke present in this courthouse?" Sutter stammered, shuffling his papers. I am not sure, Your Honor." "He is merely a consultant. I want him here." Judge Kemp interrupted, slamming her hand on the desk. "If he is in the building, the bailiff will bring him in. I want to know exactly what his role is in this family's affairs." Diane leaned down to me, placing a hand on my shoulder. Her face was grim, but there was a fire in her eyes. "He is here?" she whispered to me. "I saw him in the hallway. He thinks he is here to watch the kill. He does not know he is the prey." The heavy double doors of the courtroom swung open, and the air inside seemed to drop 10 degrees. Miles Rourke walked in. He did not look like a criminal. He looked like a man arriving for a board meeting, wearing a tailored navy suit and carrying a slim leather briefcase. He walked with the easy confidence of a man who believes he is untouchable, but I saw the colour drain from Blair's face. She had not expected him to show his face in the light. Diane Weller did not give him time to sit down. She turned to him, her voice cutting through the silence like a razor. "Mr. Rourke?" Diane said, her tone deceptively polite. "Do you or your firm receive a percentage of the managed assets once a guardianship is successfully granted?" Miles Rourke paused. He adjusted his cufflinks, offering a tight, patronizing smile to the judge. "I am a consultant, Ms. Weller. I charge a flat fee for logistical support." "Is that so?" Diane walked to the evidence table and held up a document. "Because I have a copy of the service agreement between Clearpine Advisory and Blair Kessler." Paragraph 4. Subsection B. It clearly stipulates a success fee of 15% of the total estate value, payable annually upon your appointment as financial custodian. The room went deadly quiet. Miles froze, his smile vanishing instantly. Blair stood up so fast her chair tipped over. "He told me it was standard. He said it was the only way to protect the money." "Sit down." Mrs. Kessler Judge Kemp barked. It was Evan Blair screamed, pointing a shaking finger at my son. "He made me do it. He is the one with the gambling debts. He owes $60,000 to a bookie in Cincinnati. He begged me to help him get control of the trust." Evan stood up, his face flushed with a mix of shame and rage. "You held those debts over my head. You said if I didn't sign the papers, you would send the proof to my boss and get me fired. You said we just needed to borrow against Mum's house." "Enough." Judge Kemp slammed her gavel down with a crack that echoed like a gunshot. "Bailiff, seize Mrs. Kessler's phone immediately. I want it entered into evidence for preservation. Mr. Sutter, I suggest you sit down before you find yourself held in contempt alongside your clients." Mark Sutter collapsed into his chair, wiping sweat from his upper lip. He knew his career was hanging by a thread. Diane remained standing. She looked at Evan, then at the judge. Your Honour, there is one final piece of evidence. The trust established by the late Patrick Costello contains a conditional forfeiture clause. It states that any beneficiary who initiates legal action to challenge the mental competency of the primary trustee shall automatically forfeit their entire inheritance. I watched the realization hit Evan. He blinked, his mouth opening slightly. He looked at me, and then he looked at the empty air where his future had been. He had not just failed to steal my money. He had just erased his own birthright. Evan looked at Miles Rourke. The fear in my son's eyes was replaced by a hollow, broken resolve. It was him? Evan said, his voice trembling but loud. Miles gave us the script. He told us which doctor to hire. He told Blair to turn off the TV to provoke Mom. He said old people get confused when you break their routine. He orchestrated everything. Miles Rourke lunged forward. You spineless little bailiff, Judge Kemp shouted, take Mr. Rourke into custody. I am referring this entire file to the District Attorney's Office for immediate investigation into elder fraud and conspiracy. She turned her gaze to the defense table. The petition for guardianship is denied with prejudice. Furthermore, I am upholding the forfeiture clause of the Costello Trust. Mr. Costello, Mrs. Kessler, you leave this court today with nothing. The gavel came down. It was over. The courtroom erupted into noise, but I felt a strange, quiet vacuum around me. I stood up and smoothed my skirt. I did not look at the judge. I did not look at the cheering gallery. I walked over to where my son was standing. He was weeping openly now, his hands covering his face. He lowered his hands as I approached. Mum, I am so sorry. I was just so scared. I looked at him. I looked at the boy I had raised, the man who had sold me out because he was too weak to fix his own mistakes. You traded me for the easy way out, I said, my voice steady and cold. And now you have to live with the price. I turned away before he could answer. I walked down the center aisle, the sound of my cane tapping a steady rhythm on the floor. I passed Blair, who was sobbing into her hands. I did not look at her. I did not slow down. I pushed open the heavy wooden doors and stepped out into the bright, blinding sunlight of the afternoon. Behind me, the heavy doors clicked shut, sealing the noise inside. I took a deep breath of fresh air. My silence had been my shield, and in the end, it was the only weapon I had needed to bring the predators into the light. Thank you so much for listening to my story. I would love to know where you guys are tuning in from. So please drop a comment below and let's get a conversation started. If you enjoyed this story, please make sure to subscribe to Grandma's Family Diary. Smash that like button and hit the hype button to help this video reach more people. Stay safe out there